Why is Israel routinely exempt from discussions about terrorism in the Middle East? Why has it taken several decades to confirm that the murderous Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from foreigners was an Israeli operation? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Remi Brulin. Remi Brulin, a leading authority on states and terrorism, is currently adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. He's a former adjunct and research fellow at NYU and George Washington University. His scholarly interests include terrorism and political violence, media, culture, and politics, and the sociology of violence. Dr. Remi Brulin, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Let's start with what you've described as the greatest terrorist campaign you never heard about. This refers to the Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from foreigners, which during the early 1980s carried out numerous car bombings, primarily in Beirut, which killed hundreds of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. Its name notwithstanding, it has recently been confirmed that the FLLF was in fact an Israeli rather than Lebanese front. What do we know about it? How did we learn about it? And why have revelations about its provenance received so little media attention?
Okay. What we know about it first, there's always an interesting discussion whenever we talk about the Middle East, specifically the conflict in Israel and Palestine, about the power to narrate and what sources and what voices are going to be deemed credible or not, specifically in the Western world and specifically in the US, where I live these days. So Palestinians, for a long time, meaning since the early 1980s, insisted that those car bombings, right? There were dozens and dozens of car bombings between 1979 and 1983 in Beirut that were claimed by a mysterious group that no one had heard about before, the FLLF, sometimes called the FLLA, with aliens instead of foreigners at the end. They had always claimed, and many Lebanese people, including the prime minister at the time, had always claimed that this was just a front, and that this group was fake and was used to hide the hands of Israel and its Lebanese right-wing Lebanese allies,
the Phalange,
Christian allies in Lebanon. And so these claims were there. You can find them a little bit here and there in news reports at the time, all only presented as this is what the Palestinians said, and usually with an answer from Israel denying, of course, that they had any role in it, and often actually saying that this was Arab on Arab violence, right? That Arab factions were just fighting against one another and they were using car bombs. So the claims were not taken seriously in the West, and the issue completely disappeared. There was a very good article written in 1983 in Merib by Lee O'Brien that looked at the whole campaign of car bombings. What she did was she compared the targets of those car bombings, the timing of those car bombings, to airstrikes by Israel. Notice that in many cases, those targets were exactly the same. She went in detail into a couple cases where there were actual unexploded ammunition that had Hebrew markings on them and IDF markings on them, which again seems to confirm that Israel was.
These are remnants of the car bombs.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So she wrote that long article in Merib, the one no one read it, and it had no impact whatsoever in the public discourse about terrorism. This is the early 80s. This is, right, we'll get into this later, but this is also when terrorism for Americans becomes about the Marines that are attacked in October of 83. That's what
in Beirut.
In Beirut, absolutely. So the issue goes away. It's mentioned by Professor Rashid Khalidi in one of his books, Yedik Saïd, who wrote that famous history of the PLO, mentions the bombings and mentions that most people in the region believed that Israel was behind those bombings. It's mentioned in a history of car bombings called Buddha's Wagon by Mike Davis that came up in the early 2000s, where he has a whole chapter on Beirut and car bombings and spends several pages talking about the FLLF and, showing apparent evidence or numerous claims that Israel was probably behind it. But aside from those, and in the public discourse, it's nowhere, right? Terrorism experts, quote unquote, do not write about the FLLF car bombings ever. Even though, that's interesting, there was in 1983, there was a RAND, so the RAND Corporation that's very closely linked to the Pentagon. So not Chomsky, not crazy leftists. The RAND Corporation had
Crazy rightists.
Yes, exactly. They had a report on international terrorism, and they noted that one method that terrorists were using more and more often at the time in 81 and 82 was car bombings. And they actually spend a whole page focusing on the FLLF, right? Which at the time, no one knows who they are, right? So of course they call that terrorism. They focus on a couple of weeks that were extraordinarily violent that I hope we'll get back to later, because Ariel Sharon, it turns out, was personally involved in those bombings, described their RANDs, described those bombings in detail, blah, blah, blah. But after that, it disappears, right? It's completely gone. Even though, right, there were doubts about who was behind, but there were no doubts about who the victims were.
If I could just if I could just interrupt, you do mention that two Israeli journalists look into this,
yes,
and were able to find evidence of an Israeli connection, but it was uncensored.
Yes, absolutely. So that's something. So let me backtrack to what we now know, right? So
Please,
what we now know is thanks to this book, right? Which is a book by Ronan Bergman. He's a journalist for Yedat Aronot in Israel and for the New York Times. He was hired by the New York Times basically as this book was coming out in early 2018. So that's 4 years ago, a long time ago. And so this is a book on targeted killings. It's like a history of targeting killings. And he has a whole chapter on, well, a couple chapters on Beirut in the early 1980s. And in there, even though it's really not targeted killings, in there, he has this revelations about the FLLF, where he explains that the FLLF was indeed created by senior IDF officers. So it's Raphael Eitan. It's
Chief of Staff at the time.
Yes, absolutely. Mia Dagan is involved.
Was at the time a high-ranking intelligence operative.
Yes, who would later on become the head of Mossad, right? So very, very senior officers. And Ben Gal was also a commander in Beirut at the time, right? The three of them create the FLLF. They recruit Lebanese people, right? Christians, Shia, people who do not want the Palestinians to be in Lebanon.
And sorry, this was at the time that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was based in Beirut, and
yes,
it was also the time of the Lebanese Civil War.
Absolutely, and that the FLLF is essentially created in 1979, following a quote-unquote terrorist attack by Palestinians. It's a famous case where a woman was killed with a child. And so in reaction, if you will, the Eitan, Bengal, and Dagan create the FLLF. And the objective is to sow chaos in Lebanon, right? This is a source of Bergman's who uses those words in the book, right? And what's fascinating with the book is that all the sources, all Bergman's sources are Israeli officers who either were involved in the FLLF secret operation, right? It was completely secret. Very few people at the time knew of it. Or people, so either involved or people who knew of it within the Israeli intelligence and military apparatus, right? And Bergman gives lots of details about how the bombs were built. They were built early on in a kibbutz, right? Ben-Gal lived in a kibbutz at the time, and so he used his own kibbutz to build the bombs, and then the bombs were put in donkeys or in cars, on bikes, and were taken to Lebanon, and then were exploded in refugee camps in front of PLO offices. One thing that I should note, because it's important here, is the kind of targets, right? Sometimes some of the bombs by the FLLF targeted the PLO or PLO militants, right? So that it might be argued that some of those targets were legitimate, right? Possibly, or at least that it would be the argument that people who defend this operation would use. But in many cases, those bombs, so including very large car bombs, were put in front of restaurants, in markets, busy markets, often at the busiest time of day, meaning when the most civilians would be present and therefore the most potential casualties. And in those cases, it seems pretty obvious that those acts fit any definition, any reasonable definition of terrorism. If we accept the idea that it doesn't matter who commits those acts, what matters when we define terrorism is the acts themselves, right?
And there were some cases where there would be a second explosion, just as rescue workers and others were coming to attend to the victims of the first.
Yes, there were cases like this, and there were also the same target would be attacked by a car bomb and also would be hit by airstrikes, right? Which is, as I said earlier, this is what led Lee O'Brien to conclude that it was very likely that Israel was probably behind those car bombs, because sometimes you would have an attack where the car bomb exploded and 2 minutes later or 30 seconds later, an airstrike would bomb exactly the same spot.
But it sounds, from what you're saying, it sounds like, in fact, the FLLF didn't exist. There was no organization that was either created or supported by Israel. This was, in effect, an Israeli operation using a small number of Lebanese or other collaborators. Yes,
absolutely. And so we don't know, right? Meaning we have Bergman's book now. So we have some sense of how the operation works, but it doesn't go into detail in terms of who the Lebanese, the people from Lebanon who were involved, right, in their identity. It doesn't go into that. If we were to look operation by operation, we don't know, or at least I don't, and haven't found it anywhere. We don't know who made the decision to, who picked the target, who actually was driving the car on that day, right? In some cases, we have there are things we do know, because there were at least a couple instances where the Hezbollah, people related to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, so in '83, captured members of the Lebanese army, and they confessed that they were behind several of the FLLF bombings, right?
I see.
And so we have transcripts of those of the confessions that were made by these members of the Lebanese army, right, who said that they were involved. So there's, for example, the famous case of the attack against Sheikh Fadlallah, right? That
was in 1986, I believe.
It was in 85 or 86.
5, yeah.
Right. And so this attack is famous because the CIA was probably involved, meaning that Woodward's famous Washington Post journalist in the mid-80s had a biography of
William Casey.
William
CIA
Casey, who was the director of the CIA, and on his hospital bed supposedly told him that the CIA was involved in that attack, right? At the time, in Lebanon, they had a banner that they put on the completely destroyed building. I think over 80 or 90 people were killed during this bombing. This was a gigantic bomb, right? Most of them civilians, Sheikh Adlala.
This was at a mosque right after Friday prayers, I believe.
Yeah. And well, the mosque was next door. There was also a bus that was just passing by. One of my followers on Twitter just told me like a few days ago that he had just read one of the threads I made about the FLLF and told me that he didn't know that Israel was behind that attack, but that he was in that bus and that he nearly died. So in any case, in that case, according to Casey, via Woodward, the CIA was involved. We also know that the Saudi Arabia was involved. But according to sources that Bergman quotes in his book, Israel was also involved, and it was in part at least an FLLF operation, in the sense that FLLF people who had been active in the FLLF Israeli operation were involved in that bombing, which looks like there were clear links here between these.
And this took place several years after the PLO had been expelled from Beirut during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. And the target was the late Sheikh Fadlallah, who was viewed as, let's say, the spiritual guide of Hezbollah at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And so, since you mentioned, of course, the larger context, which is the civil war in Lebanon, the conflict in Lebanon, we should talk about the role that Sharon played, probably in this.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that a bit later, and first say that you've now explained what we knew at the time. Now you've told us what we've learned in recent years, but you're virtually the only person who has been writing about this. And if you look, for example, at all the media outlets and other organizations who were covering these bombings during the early 1980s, they've had virtually nothing to say about it. Although, I think a good argument can be made that these are significant revelations of more than passing historical interest. So in your view, why has this story received so little media attention?
So first, let me paint a picture of that silence, right? That media silence. And I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the fact that 2 Israeli journalists dug up that story in 1980 and 81, right?
So as this campaign was being implemented.
Exactly, right? Close to the beginning, meaning, as we'll talk about, I'm sure later, the worst of that bombing campaign was in September, October, November of 81, when Ariel Sharon got involved. But before that, 2 Israeli journalists for Year.Aeronaut, which happens to be the newspaper that Ronan Bergman works with, they worked on that story. They were about to publish a story that would have revealed that Eitan Begin and Begin were involved and had created that terrorist group, right? And the story was censored, right? Of course, there's a military censorship system in Israel, and the story was censored. We know, at least I know, that the story was censored because it was mentioned in a couple articles that were profiles of Meir Dagan that were written in the mid 2000s, one in the New Yorker and the other one in Haaretz, the famous newspaper in Israel. And in both those profiles of Dagan, there's a very short paragraph that says, "Oh, by the way, in the early 1980s, two journalists were digging up a story that linked Dagan and others to car bombs and the FLLF, but the story was censored, and that's it. Just one paragraph in each of those stories. Now we know that the stories were true, right? Mm-hmm. And now we know that not only did the Israeli censor decide to hide that truth from the Israeli public, we also know that this was before Ariel Sharon got involved, right? Mm-hmm. And as soon as Ariel Sharon got involved, hundreds of people died, mm-hmm. hundreds of civilians died.
And
of course, this is before the invasion of Lebanon.
Yeah, and there was
this could have changed everything.
Right, and there was no attempt at the time to leak the story to, for example, foreign journalists, as is often done when the Israeli military censor suppresses stories.
That is correct. Or such attempts were made, and there were no takers on the American side. Yeah. I don't know, right? But that's a great point, because that brings us back to your question about the current silence, right? Mm-hmm. The book itself. So Bergman's book came out in late January of 2018, so 4 years ago. It was reviewed everywhere, right? The New York Times reviewed it twice. The Washington Post reviewed it. Everyone reviewed it. Bergman was invited everywhere to speak about his book. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, mm-hmm. right? And Bergman was praised for showing the dark side of Israel's practices, but nearly all the reviews were framed the book as this is how Israel has been fighting terrorism. Mm-hmm. And what's wonderful with this book is that we see that very often there are ethical dilemmas that Israel has to deal with and go through and struggle with as it's fighting terrorism, right? The assumption of every single reviewer and of every single person who's interviewed Bergman, because he went on book tours and on podcasts and talked about his book, the assumption is always, or the framework is always, let's talk about the ethical struggles as Israel is fighting terrorism.
So it's the inside account of an anti-terrorist rather than terrorist.
Exactly, right. Yeah. And yet in the book, the biggest revelation is that Israel itself, at least, right, specific officers engaged in what was at the time the biggest, largest, longest, deadliest car bombing terrorist campaign in history, mm-hmm. right? So, and so of course, the only way you have those discussions about those ethical dilemmas as we fight terrorism, the only way you can have them in a way that makes sense is by erasing the fact that we, in this case, Israel, engaged in terrorism, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what's so fascinating to me about that silence. And I've looked everywhere. I keep looking. The book was translated in French and was published in France. And in France, I wrote an article about it that was based on an article I wrote online here in the US. When the book came out in France, in one newspaper in France, there was a mention of the FLLF and a mention of how problematic it is and revealing it is that this is Israel itself using terrorism. Mm-hmm. There was a mention also in Belgium, in one Belgian, because they speak French, some of them. So I was able to read those reviews, and there was one review that was also focused on that aspect of the book. But aside from that, that's it. And also there are 2 points that are interesting to me, and I have questions, right? So the questions of why is I cannot possibly have a definitive answer. I'm not in the head of American journalists and editors who make decisions as to what is and is not newsworthy, right? So I can only make inferences and use my judgment as a historian and compare and contrast with what's happened in the past.
Observations that are often quite valuable. So please go ahead.
So let's try. So the first thing is, in Israel, it's possible. I don't know, but I've asked lots of journalists off the records. Israeli journalists do not want to talk to me about this on the records, right? Because they know what happens to the two journalists whose story was killed in 1980, was censored in 1980, right? And so they want no part of it, right? But off the record, they say that it's possible, although they don't know because the system is very vague and shadowy. It's possible that the story is still censored in Israel, right? In which case, that would explain why Haaretz has not written about it, for example, right? So I asked them, those journalists and people who know the censorship system in Israel, know the history of it, its workings, its intricacies. I asked them if it's possible that, because there's possibly an inconsistency here, because the book by Bergman went through the process of the censorship, right? And clearly the censor decided, you can publish this. You can publish the revelations about the FLLF. They're here, right? And so I asked, is it possible that this was allowed to be published in the US in English and in the French version and other versions? But is it possible that this is the case? And also at the same time, the story is still censored in Israel. And I said, yeah, it's possible. We don't know. There's no way of knowing because, right? That's how censorship works. It's all secret. There's no way of knowing, but it's possible, right? One thing that's strange to me is that Bergman himself has never talked about it, meaning he wrote the book, right? It's his revelations. They're, to me, the most shocking of all his revelations in his book. He's had ample opportunity to talk about it, right? When he's been asked about the most shocking things he found and he published in his book, he goes to other examples that are really not the same. So for example, he and other reviewers have talked about instances where Israel and Sharon and Begin nearly got this close to shooting down a civilian airplane because Arafat was on board, right?
Or believed to be on board.
Believed to be on board, yes. But of course, that's a good story because in this case, there were people in the Israeli military who refused to follow the orders, right?
Yeah, so the good guys win.
Yes, so it's something that actually reinforces the discourse, right? Because it's fighting. But he's been silent about that case, and to me that tells me that maybe he is still not allowed to talk about it privately, or he decides not to, and that would get to my answer. And the only answer I have is self-censorship.
Well, exactly.
American journalists are self-censoring.
You seem to be saying this is a case of no one was interested in asking him, and he wasn't interested in telling. So it works both ways. Yeah. But they also, I think another very interesting revelation is that as horrible and wide-ranging as this FLLF campaign in Lebanon during the early 1980s was, it was supposed to be exponentially worse when the Israelis, I believe Sharon and Eitan primarily, had organized a massive car bombing of the Beirut football stadium on the 1st of January 1982, 1st of January being the day on which the Fatah movement, the main constituent faction of the PLO, celebrates its founding. And the Israeli thinking was that the entire PLO leadership and thousands of Palestinian guerrillas and many civilians would all be in that stadium. And it was called off only at the last moment because there were concerns that the Soviet ambassador would be there and that this would cause real problems for Israel if his head was severed from his body as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So this is right. This is in Bergman's book. This operation was called Olympia 2, right?
Yeah.
There was the first one that was supposed to take place in a theater that was cancelled, and then Olympia 2, you just described it. This would have been an Israeli/FLLF operation, right? Which the FLLF is always Israeli, but from what we can gather from Bergman's book, Israel would have been really more. There would have been more of a hands-on involvement in that one, a big operation than in most other FLLF operations. But the idea was to put huge bombs under the seats, under the days where the PLO leadership would be, and then also to have 2 huge truck bombs waiting outside, right? So what we call the double tap, right? So that the survivors flee in panic, thousands of them, and then as they're fleeing, you detonate those 2 truck bombs, right? And the FLLF was apparently involved specifically in setting up those bombs outside and waiting. There were drones that were supposed to be flying over to time this perfectly, right? This is the very beginning of the drone technology, not armed drones, but drones that can fly over and surveil. As you said, canceled at the very last minute, the day before, not for ethical reasons, not because it's probably not a good idea to deploy gigantic bombs in a stadium and kill hundreds of civilians potentially, but because of the presence of the Russian ambassador, right? What's fascinating, and that goes back to your previous question, is that Bergman has talked about this. So he has talked about this, just like he has talked about the near destruction of the airplane in mid-flight. And of course, the commonality between those 2 is that at the last minute, sane people, sane men prevailed, right? And so they didn't go through, right? And that's what's so fascinating, and that's what tells me that either he's not allowed to talk about the FLLF, or there's a very, very strong reluctance in saying anything that could show Israeli officers, the Israeli state, as being not simply using ethically unsound means against the evil terrorists, but actually being the terrorist, right? There seems to be an absolute reluctance to even get there, to say, in this case, we were the terrorists, which is absolutely undeniable. And one point that's important is that Sharon is involved in Olympia 2, right? He's pushing for this.
He was by this point Israel's defense minister.
Yes, absolutely. He had been defense minister for about 6 months. And in September and October, he had used the FLLF, right? There were a series of about a dozen car bombings between September 15th and October 1st or 2nd, 1981, right? Yeah. So we just commemorated, or we did not. We did not commemorate. I did on Twitter. I did several long threads trying to commemorate the anniversary of this car bombing campaign. At least 150, up to potentially 300 civilians were killed within 2 weeks, right? These are actually the bombings that the Rand report I mentioned earlier focused on. And now Bergman tells us Sharon was involved. And he did this, right? He did this, according to the sources that Bergman mentions. He did this because he wanted to provoke the PLO into using terrorism so that he could use this excuse to justify invading Lebanon in the name of fighting terrorism.
Right. And the context here is that Israel and the PLO had reached an unprecedented UN and US mediated ceasefire in the summer of 1981. And this had proven an enormous frustration to Sharon because he needed to find a pretext to launch what eventually became the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And this takes me to my next question, which is, the irony of what we've been discussing is that Israel during the 1970s and 1980s launched a very successful campaign in Europe and North America to make Palestinian and terrorist virtually synonymous terms and interchangeable words. What you've described as a transformation of terrorism from a word into an ideology. Yet, as you've also written and you've just discussed, some of the key figures in this campaign, such as Sharon, were also active participants in the FLLF terrorist offensive. Another key figure, this time on the propaganda side, was the person who would later become Israel's longest serving prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So what can you tell us about this campaign and how Israel simultaneously managed to deflect scrutiny of its own activities?
Yeah, so the timing is stunning. So that Hasbara / propaganda communication campaign by Israel is sort of bordered by two big international conferences on international terrorism. And the first one was organized in 1979, and the second one in 1984. The first
both
one
in the United States, I believe.
So yeah, the one in Jerusalem and the second one in Washington.
Yeah.
And so 79, 84 happens to be exactly the dates when the FLLF was active. 79 it's created, and its latest claims to bombs is 84, although possibly 85 with Sheikh Fadlallah, as we discussed. So it's exactly at the same time. And so these conferences are fairly well known. For example, mostly because the second one, the one organized in Washington in 84, led to the publication of a book that was edited by Benjamin Netanyahu, who, as you said, and as everyone knows, of course, later on became Prime Minister of Israel for many, many years.
Terrorism, how the West can win.
Yes, which is telling as a title, right? How the West can win. And at the time, he is the Israeli ambassador at the UN, right? Netanyahu. And so this book was reviewed, got great reviews in most of the US media, with the huge exception of a fantastic essay that everyone can look for. I highly recommend it. It's online, by Edward Said, called The Essential Terrorists.
In the Nation.
It's a critique of the book and of the discourse on terrorism that is being born in front of his eyes, Edward Said's eyes at the time. It's an absolutely fantastic book that foretells everything that has happened since.
I think you meant to say fantastic review.
Yes. Yeah. Fantastic review. Yes. The book is right. The book it's not a book, right? It's just a compilation of speeches. And so the first one was organized in 79. It's organized by an institute called the Jonathan Institute. And it's named Jonathan after Jonathan Netanyahu, who was the older brother of Benjamin. And he was a member of the special forces in Entebbe, right? The famous raid of Entebbe.
1976.
Yes.
And was killed in that operation. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And this is important also because Entebbe plays an important role here because for the US, especially the American right, the context here, the late 70s, mid-late 70s, early 80s, is Vietnam, right? It's the defeat in Vietnam. It's the withdrawal in shame of Vietnam. It's the notion of decline, right? Which is, of course, part of the big, broad context for the end of the Carter administration and the election of Reagan, right?
Reagan in 1980.
Promoting in America, and we're gonna rise up. And so for a few years there in 76, following Entebbe, Israel is playing this symbolic role as that Western world, right? That it presents itself clearly as a Western world that has clear morals, that is ready to fight, ready to use force, that wins, whereas we lose, right? We have lost that will, that strength to act in the world, right? So that's going to be part of why the Israeli discourse on terrorism is really going to catch on. So that's right. Jonathan Institute. Jonathan was at Entebbe. He's killed. He's the only victim on the Israeli side. And the first conference takes place in Jerusalem, as I said, and explicitly the idea is to can read from Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the father of Benjamin. We must build an international front of freedom, right? We must fight against international terrorism, right? It's the idea is to unite the Western world against barbarism. The Western world is by definition civilized in that discourse, and the terrorists are the epitome, right? The perfect example, perfect illustration of barbarism, of the barbarism of the other, right?
The message being Israel's enemies are the world's enemies.
Exactly, right? The Western world's enemy.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So that's the idea of the first conference. It's a who's who of Israeli leaders and American leaders, with a couple exceptions that are interesting. There are a couple sort of left to center-ish European participants, to Prime Minister of, I believe, Holland, actually, who is there at the first conference and who is not convinced. He's the only one with another one. Two of them are not convinced that it's that simple and think that maybe we should also focus on the terrorism by states. These voices completely disappear in 84. They're not there anymore. By 84, the discourse has been bordered very clearly. It's got clear frontiers. There are things that cannot be said anymore. And by 84, the focus is on, so this international terrorist network, right? At the heart of which are many Arab states, the Soviet Union, of course, plus Cuba, Nicaragua with the Sandinistas, right? All of this is this big international terrorist network, and the Western world needs to have moral clarity and to fight against this new threat, and to use force, right? And
so terrorism has become a full-fledged ideology by this point.
Completely, yes.
Yeah.
And we need to use force, right? The big difference between the first in 79 and the second conference in 84 is this emphasis on force, on actual solutions. And Benjamin Netanyahu, in his introduction to his book, says that clearly, says the first conference was very successful. We convinced the civilized world that we are all in this together with fighting evil terrorists. We have the moral high grounds. We have moral clarity, right? Very interestingly, they always focus, participants, they always focus on clarity of language. They accuse the terrorists and those who support them or are too weak and do not want to, use force against the terrorists. They accuse them of distorting language, right?
And
by claiming that they're for freedom, but also by accusing us of being the terrorists.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating because, again, in this context, at the same time, the FLLF is happening. Right?
Yeah, and
at the same time, bombs are exploding in marketplaces, and clearly we are using terrorism.
And by this point, terrorism is defined not by an action that's undertaken, but by the identity of the perpetrator. And
yes, although I mean, in action, yes, like in practice, that you're absolutely right. But the claim is that we have moral clarity and that we define terrorism. Terrorism is the indiscriminate use of force against civilians.
Yeah.
And we never do that. That's why
Right.
we're never terrorists. They
Right.
do it. That's why they are, right?
Yeah.
So there's a claim that it's clear, it's easy to define terrorism. And if you apply the definition, it just so happens that we're not.
Yeah.
But and fantastically, it's so ironic, but Menachem Begin says that.
Yeah.
Of course, Menachem Begin was a terrorist
who blew up
in
the King
1930s.
David Hotel in Jerusalem in the late
amongst so
1940s,
many
killing
others.
90
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which takes me to my next point, which is, as you probably know, the title of this episode, Israel's Sacred Terrorism, is taken from that of a book by the late Israeli journalist, Livia Rokach. Her book is based on the diaries of former Israeli Foreign Prime Minister Moshe Sharet. And in it, Rokach details a series of Israeli killing sprees, this time during the 1950s, that are not unlike those in Lebanon that we've been discussing today. A number of such acts, such as the 1953 Qibya massacre, even elicited condemnation by the UN Security Council at the time, meaning the resolution passed with not only European, but also US support. Yet if one were to review the Western press since 1948, as you've just been explaining, you would be very hard pressed to find even a single reference to Israeli terrorism. Although before 1948, one could find in the British press, for example, numerous such references to the terrorism of the Zionist militias at the time.
And wanted posters.
Exactly. So does this reflect the long-standing identification with Israel by the Western media? Does it reflect a more general pattern by Western media to go easy on states, their government support? Or is there perhaps a broader ideological position at play that states don't engage in terrorism?
Right. Well, so it always like very difficult to answer that kind of question, right? Where you get to the why, right? Why is media? Because first of all, because the media is so broad, right? So I doubt that there is one explanation for a process that's itself so broad. I think it's a little bit of those three, right? What's interesting, for example, is if you look at 1972, right? So Munich, the Olympic Games, a group of Palestinians, Black September, take hostages amongst the Israeli team, end up killing several of them, right? It's all on, live on TV for the first time. So it's one of those iconic international terrorism acts, right? Look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or other American newspapers at the time, when Nixon condemns the Munich attacks, many commentators say, yes, of course, we should condemn it. But this is so hypocritical because right now, we, meaning Nixon, is bombing Vietnam. And if Munich was terrorism, then of course, what we're doing in Vietnam is terrorism too, except on a much bigger scale. And you can find many of those articles at the time. So there is a sense that that at least to some extent, before there was an actual discourse at the political level, in the media, you could find examples like this, many examples like those of the term being used to refer to our own acts. So our broadly understood, meaning Western countries, right? Israel, the US, France, whatever, right? But I would say that, again, it's very difficult to completely measure this, right? We're talking about the media as a whole, but if you focus on just a couple newspapers, for example,
the leading newspapers of the day,
then you can see that it becomes less and less those mentions of those uses of the word terrorism or the adjective terrorist to refer to our own acts clearly go down as the discourse itself becomes more and more hegemonic, right?
Right.
But there's also the deeper question of whether or not states can be terrorists, right?
Right, and I'd like to get to that in a moment, in a different part of the discussion, because I think, you know, what you've just said, it's very interesting, let's say, to fast forward a few years, and then to look at the aftermath of the September 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States, and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that during this period, terrorism assumed a centrality in US political and media discourse that is in many respects similar to that in Israel that we've spoken about. Now, you wrote your doctoral dissertation on the development of US engagement with terrorism since 1945. And you found that while Israel was a significant influence in shaping American views, this really dates from the early 1980s, and that the Reagan administration's covert wars in Central America during that period played an equally, if not more important role. So if we shift the focus a bit now, tell us more about the development of terrorism as a prominent theme in US foreign policy, and what were the main signposts in this historical trajectory?
Right. So one thing that I've done in my research is focus specifically on the presidential discourse, right? And you can do that more or less scientifically because we have databases now. So it's actually
all the statements are there, and
yeah. So you can just look for, you know, every single speech or official documents that belongs to the presidential papers, and so you can get a sense of how often the term was used by previous presidents and in what context and everything. The term is not used by presidents essentially so to give you an example, Roosevelt used it 4 times, right? That's it. In 2.5 terms that he served as president, he used it 4 times, always to refer to the Nazis in Germany, right? To refer to air bombings, to refer to submarine warfare, which is interesting, by the way, because the Allies, we did the same, right? He calls that terrorism, and of course we did it too, right? We did air bombing of German cities, meaning we engaged in terrorism, if you accept Roosevelt's own use of the term when referring to the Nazis. And we used submarine warfare in the same way that the Nazis did. So apparently we engaged in terrorism during World War II, according to but anyway,
and the minor issue of atomic weapons, but do go
on.
Of
course. Yes, of course. So right, the term is basically not there. Johnson uses it maybe 15-20 times. He has one speech where he talks about Vietnam, and actually he's the first one to talk about the terrorists. He uses the word like 6 or 7 times in that one article, in that one speech, but that's it. After that, it goes away. And of course, the terrorists here are the Viet Cong, right? And of course, it's interesting because the Viet Cong are terrorists, but we are air bombing using napalm and free fire zone and everything, but we're not terrorists, right? And in that discourse, but there is no discourse about terrorism, right? In all of those speeches, the term is always used just once, right? So
it's just one of many rhetorical.
Yeah, it's just one of those words, but there's no ideology behind it. There's no threat that's called the terrorist threats, right? There's no enemy, with the exception of that one speech. There's no enemy that's called the terrorists, right? In that sense, it doesn't exist. Even Nixon, following Munich, in most of his speeches after Munich, he calls them international outlaws. He calls them thugs. He calls them criminals. He describes what they did as having been abhorrence, which of course it was, but he does not call them terrorists, right? When the U.S. Air Marshal program is launched, very oddly on September 11, 1970, what are the odds? the term air pirates, air piracy, hijackers are used because, right, we have many words to talk about those acts without having to resort to the word terrorism. So that term doesn't exist, or is used very rarely just for specific acts or specific actors, but there's no ideology of it, right? Carter uses it a lot at the end of his term for obvious reasons. It's in relationship to the hostage crisis in Iran. But he uses it only in that context, right? Not at all to talk about terrorism as a whole. The idea of that there is such a thing as the terrorist threat, of terrorism as a thing that poses a threat, can be seen for the first time in the Republican Party's platform. So when Reagan is running in 1980, suddenly they have 2 or 3 paragraphs talking about the terrorist threat, right? But as soon some of it is about the Middle East, right? They mentioned Entebbe. They also had mentioned Entebbe in their platform in '76, right? But as soon as Reagan comes, is in the White House and is in power, when he talks about terrorism, as you said, it's about Latin America. Specifically, it's about Central America. Specifically, it's about Nicaragua and El Salvador. And the idea there is that the Sandinistas, right, just overthrew the Somosas dictatorship, a family that had been backed up by the US for 40 or 50 years. They're, of course, supported by, or they're close to the Soviet Union and Moscow.
Cuba.
And so the Sandinistas are going to be called terrorists, right, by Ronald Reagan. And therefore, the support for the Contras, right, is going to be support for freedom fighters who are fighting the terrorists. And in El Salvador, the governments that has been that is a dictatorship that has been supported by the US for decades. There has been at that point for years efforts in Congress
by the FMLN. Yeah.
Yes, so there's been efforts in Congress by Democrats to condemn the Salvadoran government for human rights violations, right? Specifically also for its support for death squads, right? And so the argument by the Reagan administration is going to be that the focus is going to be moved from human rights violations to terrorism, because terrorism is the worst kind of human rights violation. Right. And they're going to use that little sleight of hand there to say, in El Salvador, there is human violations on all sides, but the worst kind of human rights violation is terrorism, and the terrorists are the FMLN. And to fight against them, we need to help the government.
Right. So you have this interesting situation.
Which turns into helping the death squads. And when you look at the actual numbers at the end of the decade, the death squads were responsible for about 95% of the human rights violations.
Well, you have this
they were the terrorists.
You have this interesting situation where in Nicaragua, the US was supporting insurgents.
Yes.
And in El Salvador was supporting the government against a different group of insurgents, justifying both as kind of a broader integrated anti-terrorist campaign.
Yes. Yes, and it's right for the whole Cold War up until that point, the US had been a status quo power, right? And the Soviet Union was on the side of the freedom fighters / national liberation movements, the non-state actors, right? What's new with Reagan is the support for UNITA in Africa,
Angola,
in Angola, the support for the Contras, and also, of course, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? For the first time, the US is still a status quo power in many parts of the world, right? In South Africa, of course, with the apartheid regime, right? But in El Salvador, in Chile, in Guatemala, in Argentina, it's still a status quo power. It's still backing up all those awful dictators. But in other places, it's supporting those non-state actors, right? Those counter-revolutionaries, which makes it really tricky for the US to define terrorism.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because you've also examined the development of the US definition of terrorism and the positions it took on the matter at, for example, the United Nations,
Mhm.
and some of the contradictions that emerged in the process, specifically where the US took the perhaps reasonably sounding approach that terrorism is already covered, the activities that most people would refer to as terrorism are already covered by international law, and therefore don't need a separate definition, while at the same time also adopting a position that there is such a thing as state-sponsored terrorism. So tell us a little bit about how that developed.
Right. So this is a little confusing. The American position is a little confusing. But so what I found in my research, right, is that there is not one discourse on terrorism, American discourse on terrorism. There are many multiple contradictory discourses, plural, on terrorism. And those discourses, they take place in different fora, different contexts, right? Mm-hmm. So the discourse by Reagan is going to be completely contradicted by the discourse that's put forth by U.S. representatives at the UN, right?
Mm-hmm. This is the 1980s again.
Yes. So we are in the 1980s, and at the UN, the debates on international terrorism started after Munich. Mm-hmm. So immediately after Munich, Kurt Waldheim, who is the UN Security General, a former Nazi, not that this is relevant, but it's kind of crazy. He decides that international terrorism should be put on the agenda of the General Assembly. And immediately in 1972, there are clear disagreements amongst all member states as to what terrorism is, right? Mm-hmm. And to oversimplify, for the rest of the world, we are the terrorists, meaning the US are terrorists because of Vietnam, South Africa are terrorists because of apartheid. Israel is engaged in terrorism because of what happened to all those villages in the Nakba, because of what Zionists did in the years prior to the construction, to the creation of the State of Israel, and of course for us, broadly speaking, for the Western world, terrorism should mostly be about what non-state actors do. Right, mm-hmm. But some states are not clear, right? Mm-hmm. France is not very clear. European countries overall are not very clear, and the more the European Union gets constructed, the less clear it's going to get, because they're going to realize that they have to speak with one voice. Mm-hmm. And so in order to smooth over the differences, they're going to end up saying nothing and essentially deciding not to speak on how they define terrorism. Mm-hmm. But to stick to the US, in the 80s, the US is the only country, the only one, the only member state at the General Assembly to say over and over and over again. So those debates happen every other year, odd years. So starting in 81, they will say, when a state is involved, it's not terrorism. When a state is directly involved or indirectly involved, it's not terrorism, because, as you said, international law already covers uses of force by a state. So we do not need another concept, right? We don't need to include state acts in a definition of terrorism, right?
And this wasn't so much an ideological position as
it's a very
statement of fact.
Position. Yeah. It's a legal position that makes sense. And what makes sense in it, to me, is that it doesn't artificially separate between state terrorism, like direct uses of force by the state, and indirect uses of force by the state, right? Mm-hmm. It puts all of it together, and it decides that none of those are terrorism, right? Mm-hmm. And in 83,
sorry, and just to clarify, nothing a state does is defined as terrorism, because any such activities by a state are already illegal under international law. Yeah. Yes,
and the argument by the US is that the words that US representatives use all the time. His name, Michael Rosenstock, Robert Rosenstock, one of the main legal minds of the US at the UN for decades. He speaks on those issues, and he always says that it's neither useful nor necessary to use that concept of terrorism because those crimes are already covered, those practices are already covered by international law, right? And he gives an example in '83. There was a bombing in Rangoon in Burma. It was an assassination attempt against the Korean
delegation. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Several of the members of the delegation were killed. It was condemned around the world as an act of terrorism, including, this is important, by Ronald Reagan on many occasions, right? Investigations are launched, and in the process, we learn that some people are arrested, and it turns out that these people were agents of North Korean government, right? And at the UN General Assembly, Rosenstock, the American representative, explains very clearly, he says, a few weeks ago, this happened. It looked like this was exactly the kind of acts that this committee is meeting about and is talking about when we talk about international terrorism, right? It looked like this was what we should be fighting for. But then he adds, but there were investigations and inquiries, right? And the police discovered that the perpetrators were state agents. Therefore, it's not terrorism for us, America, right? This is not an act of terrorism because it's already covered by international law, right? What's fascinating is that this is '83. The attacks against the Marines in Beirut just took place.
Same year.
And the US never mentions it during the debates, right? Which sort of makes sense because the US was insisting at the same time that that states were involved in those attacks, right? At sponsored.
Specifically Iran. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Iran,
right?
Syria,
So they don't mention it, right? They're the only ones, meaning that you have this very strange reality where many other countries other than the US, right, mention the attacks in Beirut as an example of international terrorism that we should fight against. But the US doesn't mention it because
even though it was the object of these attacks.
Right. And what's important to understand here is that the US does that because at the UN, it has to face accusations of terrorism all the time, right? In my research, that's what I call an adversarial context of enunciation, right? As opposed to Reagan, when he talks to the American public, this is completely non-adversarial. He can say whatever he wants, right? So in that context, he can define terrorism as broadly as possible and then apply it to only American enemies. And he counts on the media to not push back. And he's right to count on this because the media basically never pushes back, never forces him to define terrorism. But at the General Assembly, at every single session, you have people saying, what about the CIA who just bombed the harbors in Nicaragua? That's in '84. What about the CIA support for the Contras? What about the CIA support for the Mujahideens? In that context, the US needs an answer. And the answer is, that's not about terrorism, right? Terrorism, it's not terrorism because states cannot be engaged in terrorism. But of course, the huge contradiction here is that at the exact same time, Reagan is talking about state terrorism all the time and about state-sponsored terrorism all the time. He condemns North Korea for the bombing in Rangoon in the same speech where he condemns Syria, Libya, Iran for sponsoring terrorists, right? So you have those two discourses that are completely mutually exclusive. Completely, right? But so, that's the only way that the US can exist.
Yeah. Because on the one hand, state terrorism does not exist, but then the US develops the separate category of state-supported terrorism.
Right, but at the UN, even state-supported terrorism doesn't exist, right? None of it exists. Which
you're talking about the American position at the UN.
Yes, right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and they're the only ones, right? They are the only country to have ever made that position. They've repeated it time and time again, and importantly, it's never been reported. Right? Meaning, I went to the to the UN archives here in New York, where I live, and when I was doing my research at NYU, and I just started reading because, you know, I'm a historian, so I was just reading. And one day I found this, and I'm like, that makes no sense. I've never seen this. This contradicts everything that Reagan was saying. And then when I saw this, I started to look for it. And once I started to look for it, I found it everywhere. But it was never reported in the media, so that the contradiction, right, between those two positions was never presented to the American public, right? Which is it, right? Are we? Does it exist or does it not? Why does the State Department have a list, an official list of state sponsors of terrorism, if at the UN we're saying that state-sponsored terrorism doesn't exist? Like,
right?
Which one is it? But right, and there's that sense that the US, it's my sense, right? But there is a sense that the US, I cannot prove this, but that the US does this because it knows that it's not going to be covered. It knows that it can have different, completely contradictory discourses in different fora, in different places at the same time. And no one is going to know because no one is going to cover it. And terrorism experts are not going to write about it. And no one has, right? Until I published something about it, no one had even looked, right?
As that great philosopher Boris Johnson once said, I believe in cake and I believe in eating it.
There you go.
Finally, I'd like to turn to a broader question, which is that your research and writing is ultimately about the impunity enjoyed by state terrorists and their continued ability to evade accountability. And this reflects not only political support for such activities in Western capitals, but also a compliant media that helps keep it off the public agenda. And I think you've just given a very good example of the definitional issues introduced at the United Nations. So what, in your view, needs to change so that the types of campaigns like the FLLF and others that we've been discussing are more effectively challenged?
Well, you know, I cannot promise that it would work, but I think that at the very least, we need to do much more in deconstructing the discourse, like the way like we've been doing right now, the way I try to do and many, there are many researchers who belong to this school of critical terrorism studies, right? That write and that are very critical of the kind of orthodox terrorism analysis that has existed for like 40 years now. I think language matters. I think that we need to, every time, I mean, I didn't do this too much today, but I used to, every single time I use the word terrorist or terrorism in class or doing an interview or always go like this, to just say this word right here, if we want to use it, we need first to have a serious discussion about how we define it. And a discussion that's serious in the sense that we need to apply it to a lot of historical examples and see how comfortable we feel about the definition, right? So like throughout the 80s, that period is fascinating because Democrats and Republicans completely disagree on who are the terrorists, right?
No longer.
Right. No, I know precisely. And so the Cold War is over, right? So those differences, right? Because so South Africa, for example, right? In 1988, the platform for the Democratic Party proposed that South Africa should be named a terrorist state. Right. At the same time, for the Republicans, the ANC, ANC and Mandela, right, were terrorists.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So clear opposition, right? But the Cold War is over. All of those, most of those conflicts are gone. The conflict in Ireland is over as well, right? Which was tricky for the definition, but because lots of Irish Americans wanted to be able to send weapons to the IRA, to charities that would then funnel those to the IRA. So it was difficult to find a definition that was kind of somehow magically exclude all of those acts. But, you know, by 95, 96, that conflict over there had been solved. The Cold War was over. So the US Congress was actually able to pass this material support to terrorism laws because essentially it was the definition was going to be applied only to the Middle East, and in the Middle East, everyone agrees, Democrats and Republicans, on who the terrorists are. So you can, act without having to
Problem
worry
solved.
about the definitional issues. So language is important, and to me, it's really important because if you're serious about the definition, then it has very important implications in terms of our uses of force. So I wrote about this a little bit, but if you go back to the FLLF, right, where we started, what Bergman, for example, tells us is that Eitan and Dagan would go to that kibbutz in Israel, and they would build bombs there, and then they would ship those bombs, and those bombs would kill civilians, right? If this is accurate, right, and I see no reason to not believe the sources that Bergen mentions, right? If this is accurate, then clearly Eitan, Dagan, Sharon, they were all terrorists, right? If this is accurate, then in that kibbutz, there was something called like a terrorist lab, I suppose, which is a term that we use when the evil terrorists are building bombs. Right?
Inhabited by human shields.
Right. Yes, exactly. Right. And everyone else in the kibbutz, right, are either human shields, or if someone was to use force against them, would be collateral damage. Right. So the question I ask very often is, how would we react if the PLO or if Lebanon, a state, right, had decided to bomb that bomb-making facility, the terrorist facility, right, had killed Eitan or Dagan or Bengal or any of them, plus a few people who lived in that kibbutz, right, and had claimed that this was a completely legitimate act of self-defense against terrorists, right, which they were objectively terrorists, and that whoever got killed, that was a discriminate use of force.
A price worth paying.
Yes, we were not planning on killing them. This is just collateral damage.
Yeah.
To me, it's obvious that we would reject that claim. And we would actually say that act was an act of terrorism. Right. To me, it seems obvious that we would say, Lebanon, when you do this, when you bomb that kibbutz, we don't care what you say about those car bombs and blah, blah, blah. This was an act of terrorism. And if I'm correct, then we do not have the right to use force in the many, many ways that we do when we are acting against the terrorists.
Language matters and policy matters. Remi Brulin, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.